In this sublesson, we're going to talk about hard drive failures. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Hard drives will fail. It's just a matter of time. This sublesson contains a big mix of elements. There's a lot of things that we're going to be talking about, so keep in mind that we're going to be running through a lot of possible issues with hard drives. Let's get started with the sublesson now.
We'll start with read-write failures and slow performance. If you have a little bit of a problem reading data from the drive or writing data to the drive, let's say you can't save a Microsoft Word document or another document that you're working in, or let's say it's very slow. Let's say you load up an application or a file and it's very slow coming up on your screen. Well, you're going to want to analyze that further, and there's several tools you can use to do that. One of the first tools is disk management. You can open this from the search tool, or you can go to the run prompt and type disk mgmt.msc. It's also in the computer management. And so however you want to get to it, once you open it, you'll see all of your volumes, and you'll see the healthy status. Well, you'll see the status column, and hopefully they're healthy. But quite often, if you're getting a lot of read-write failures or slow performance, it may say something different here. So you're going to want to check that out, and it also shows it here, whether they're healthy or not. It could be that you have too much data on that particular volume. You know, for example, this volume here, C, has 120 gigabyte capacity, and the free space is only 24 gig. If we start going any lower than that, if we start getting below, say, 15% free, you might actually see some performance degradation and even possibly some read-write failures, but possibly that slow performance on this guy. So this disk, you know, it's getting pretty packed, and I'm going to have to work on that, to be honest with you. You're going to have to check that and probably remove some data, move it to another partition, another volume, or uninstall some applications, etc. But the main thing here is that status. You really want to check that status field and see if your device is healthy or not. And if not, then you might have to do one of a couple things. First, you might need to do a disk defrag. And disk defragmenter, this can be opened up with from the search tool or from the run prompt. You can type DFR GUI, and that'll bring up your disk defragmenter tool, and you can check each volume that has been activated and has been formatted. It has to be a formatted volume to show up here. You see here that my C drive is 1% fragmented. Not a big deal, but it wasn't checked. It wasn't analyzed since 2 years ago. So if you see that, then you're definitely going to want to analyze the disk, and if necessary, defrag it. Generally, you don't have to unless it's 5% or higher fragmented. This becomes a little less of an issue with solid-state drives, but contrary to some of the popular belief out there, solid-state drives do sometimes need to be defragged as well. And so that'll depend, though. But generally, it's the magnetic disks that you're looking at. You want to see if they're 5%, 10% fragmented. Then you want to run the disk defragmenter. So if you have read-write failures or slow performance, that's a couple of things you can check. You can also go to your command prompt and use some of your hard drive checking tools. For example, check disk. And you'll see you have lots of options if you do a /?. For example, /F can fix some errors on the disk that might be causing you the slow performance. And you might also have bad sectors, and you can try to recover those with the /R. So that's a possibility as well. So a couple tools there in the command prompt. For example, also SFC you might use, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next sublesson. So use your command prompt, use your disk defragmenter, use your disk management to check on hard drive issues and see what the problem is. These usually can be fixed, through a combination of check disk and disk defrag and uninstalling applications that are causing problems. Usually these things can be fixed. But there are other symptoms you might encounter that get a little bit worse. For example, loud clicking noises. If you start to hear clicking or grinding from a drive that uses moving parts, a drive that is a magnetic disk, then you're going to want to back up that data right away. Verify the backup and make sure that you can view that data from another system and make sure that backup went through okay. Use the verification option when you do the backup and then actually view some of the data on that drive. Randomly select some data and make sure it comes up properly on another system, and then replace that drive altogether, reload the OS, and restore the data. Don't mess with any loud clicking noises. The only time that loud clicking noises is okay is for much older SCSI drives, parallel SCSI drives. Nowadays, you don't want that. For the newer SCSI drives, serial attached SCSI drives, you're not going to have that. And you shouldn't have that for a SATA magnetic disk. And you shouldn't have any noise for a solid state drive. Next, it's failure to boot. Well, if you can't boot to the drive, well, that's the big problem, right? And then you're going to want to look at this from more of a physical and firmware standpoint. If there's a failure to boot altogether, then you're going to want to check in the BIOS or your UEFI, see if the drive is recognized, and see if it is the first drive on the BIOS boot order, or at least somewhere on the BIOS boot order where it would be possible to boot from. Then you're also going to want to check the connections. You may need to check the power and data connections to that drive. Make sure that it is getting power and that those connections are secure. The drive might not be recognized. It could be for some reason that the firmware didn't recognize the drive and you need to update the firmware with a flash, or the drive isn't connected properly, or perhaps Windows did not recognize the drive. It's a possibility. It's also possible that that drive was not initialized. Again, in disk management, if you have a drive that you want to use, you've got to initialize that disk. And you've got to do this here in some cases in order for it to show up in Windows Explorer or File Explorer. And you also want to make sure that it is formatted to a file system, for example, NTFS. Here, the C drive is formatted to NTFS, and we can use it. And that's why we could see it in the disk defragmenter and in Windows Explorer. But the G drive, that's raw. That means it hasn't been formatted yet. I created the primary partition. You can see that with the dark blue here, but hasn't been formatted. So it shows up as raw, and it won't show up in Windows Explorer or File Explorer, and it won't show up in the disk defragmenter because it's not been recognized fully yet. So a couple possibilities for the drive not being recognized. And the OS not found. That's always a good message as well. The operating system not found, then you can't boot to the OS. This is the bane of technicians. And it could be, again, a media issue. It could be that the boot priority is not configured properly. And there could be it could be that there's a faulty disk in the optical drive, and the optical drive is set to first. You always check that BIOS boot order. If not, you're going to have to look at that hard drive and see what the problem is. Now, if the hard drive seems to be accessing properly, but the operating system isn't there, then you're going to want to go further. You're going to want to check the boot sector, the master boot record if you're using MBR, check the GPT if you're using that, and check the main boot manager file. So, for example, for Windows 7 or Windows 8, that's going to be boot MGR. You're going to want to check if that file is there, if it's loading up properly. You can always take the drive and take it out of the system and slave it to another machine and see if those files are there. See if anything needs to be replaced. You can also do an automated repair if necessary. But generally, it's a priority type of thing, or the drive hasn't been recognized, that type of thing. So that's some of the common symptoms you might see. Your read-write failures, your slow performance. And again, remember to use that disk management tool for that. It's going to be very telling. You're going to be able to identify a lot of problems from here, and then you'll know which way to go to fix the problems. Again, you might have to defrag the drive, do a check disk, you run an SFC, which, by the way, you have to run as an administrator in the command prompt. Loud clicking noises, you're going to need to replace that drive right away. You have to back up the data right away. Imaging the drive might not be a good idea because that might put it over the edge. So watch out for that. Definitely back up all the data and check that data somewhere else, and then restore to a new drive. Failure to boot, drive not recognized, OS not found. For these things, make sure that you check the connections. Make sure that you check the BIOS or the UEFI boot priority. Make sure that the firmware can actually identify the drive, which may require a flash of that firmware. And make sure that the MBR and the boot system is set up properly. Sometimes you might have a dual boot, or you might have changes to the operating system, which change the MBR or the GPT. And you might need to go into the startup repair. You might need to go into the Windows recovery environment and either do an automatic startup repair or use the bootrec command to repair the system with the rebuild BCD option and or the fix boot option, and maybe even the fix MBR if you're doing a dual boot. So lots of possibilities here and some things to watch for when it comes to hard drive issues.